couple that come to mind. Mexican manufacturing, like I pointed out before, has got everything in its favor, and also the industries that support it. So, for instance, there's a skills shortage, a sort of mid-level skills shortage in Mexico, as in most of Latin America. So technical colleges would have, and there's a lot of U.S. technical colleges looking to invest in Mexico, and their clients will essentially be the international manufacturers that need their graduates. Another one would be the consumer side of the Brazilian economy, so the consumer goods, retailing, and finance, consumer finance. All across Latin America, consumer finance has been growing at about 15 to 25% per year for almost 10 years running, but it still has legs. Not quite what it had before, but it's still, consumer finance is still, or credit has still not penetrated across Latin America as to its full potential. And the next great hope is sort of the mortgage market. And in Brazil, less than 1% of households have mortgages. And as the interest rates come down to, we still consider them, ridiculously high, but you can now get a mortgage in Brazil for about 12%, which is, historically low. And so that's going to widen the mortgage market, and that's exciting. Another area would be real estate development, commercial real estate development in Colombia. There is a great need for commercial malls. There's a lot more spending power, and there's very little on the supply side there. You have to have a real stomach for legal fees because the sort of claims and counterclaims on pieces of property are a bit challenging to read in Colombia, and you need a good lawyer to sort through all that. But there is definitely demand potential. A lot of retailers are crying out for more and more space. Generally, I'm bullish on mining across the region. Really, the revenue side of mining has relatively little risk. It really comes down, and the operating costs, today's mining companies, know how to employ best practices. The risk for mining anywhere in the world is now around the political sphere. And it comes in two forms. One is the national government that is your host government, and how you deal with them and the set of rules they set out and their ability to stick to those rules. But the other side of it is local issues. Across Latin America, there is a failure by federal governments to transfer the rents that they collect to the local communities. And local communities easily become jealous of the fact that billions of dollars are being spent in their backyard and they're seeing very little benefit of this. This has been a historic problem, for instance, in Peru. And so it unfortunately falls upon mining companies to not rely on the federal government to fulfill their promises to build schools and hospitals and improve roads near the mine. You're going to have to do it. And you're going to have to negotiate that into your agreement so that that money goes directly, or keep that money aside to make that investment yourself. Otherwise, you face local political risk, and it can often be difficult for the federal government to even police that. So those are some of the opportunities I see. On the downside, I think that the long-term, the big story in the energy sector will be the expansion of U.S. output over the next 5 years. It will dramatically change energy pricing, particularly natural gas, and I think will, in one way, be a positive at controlling some of the politics in places like Venezuela and Ecuador, because it will take, there will be less and less need to buy the output from those countries. And buyers and the contracts they sign will have a lot more choice nationally, domestically, as well as in Canada. And so I think generally investment in hydrocarbons in Latin America will not be as exciting over the next 10 years as it has been in the last 10 years. But mining will continue to be very exciting.
Eduardo?
Well, I'll go with two themes and then one product. I think the first theme is consumers outside of Brazil in the good Latin American countries, so basically the Pacific Alliance. They're all countries that have extremely low debt burdens. All of them have consumer debt to GDP of under 30%, which is extremely low. They have very favorable demographics, and they're all economies that are growing 4 to 6% a year. So incomes are growing extremely fast. They have access to credit, and there's young people, and I think that the consumer boom still has a long way to run in those countries. In Brazil, I like it in the longer run, but I think first they have to go through a deleveraging process. If you look at, for example, Brazilian households, they're paying basically the same share of their income in debt service now as the US was paid at the peak of their pre-crisis levels. I don't think that's a systemic problem for Brazil. The Brazilian banks are extremely well capitalized. They have tier 1 capital ratios of around 18%, which are among the highest in the world, and the government is in extremely sound fiscal situation, and the central bank has a lot of liquidity. So I don't think it's a systemic problem for Brazil, but I think it's a growth hurdle for the next few years. So I think Brazil later, now the Pacific Alliance, the consumers. In the second theme, I think is very positive, is infrastructure. The growth projects of all the countries in Latin America have infrastructure as a key theme. In Brazil, you have the World Cup and the Olympics coming, and although the projects have been delayed, once the deadlines for the World Cup and Olympics approach, I think the government is going to go all out to push whatever is necessary to have things ready. So I think Brazil's a big infrastructure story, and the same holds for Chile to a lesser degree, because they already have fairly well-developed infrastructure. But Colombia, they've reclaimed massive amounts of the country from the guerrillas, and as Michael said, there's a possibility for even that to be resolved. So the infrastructure story in Colombia is going to be massive. They also have very deep pension systems, and in Mexico, the manufacturing will require massive amounts of infrastructure. The pension funds are very deep, and they also double every 5 years, and they're increasing their exposure into the infrastructure. They just developed a new form of infrastructure investment structure that has been well received. This year, there's several IPOs of companies who invest in these structures coming out. And I think the third theme I would choose, and one more tied to my field, I think local currency bonds. The yields on external debt have become extremely tight. Colombia just came out with a bond paying less than 1% over U.S. Treasuries, but the local yields are still very attractive. You do have the currency exposure, but at the end of the day, those are betas to the S&P 500, so they'll go up and down with your equities, most of them to a lesser degree. But as opposed to equities, the yield on buying local bonds is around 7% if you go to 10 years. So I think the local bonds have a lot of potential. They have high yields, and in several of the currencies, I think there's upside, particularly in Chile and Mexico, where the central banks are not stepping in and you have liquidity coming in. So I would expect both currencies to try to appreciate.